Hello and welcome back to another unit review for Star Wars Legion, and today we are going to be putting the final nail in the coffin for the Kashyyyk Wave, and taking a look at our final heavy unit for the Separatist, which is of course going to be the NRN-99 Persuader class tank, also known as the Snail Tank, for very apparent reasons. And if you go back to one of my very early prediction videos for Star Wars Legion, this was a very high priority unit that I wanted to see in the game, and I think a lot of other players were definitely looking forward to seeing this appear on the tabletop, including myself, and now we finally have it, and it is a very interesting unit. So with no further ado, let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at the Persuader class tank's unit card. And first up here, we are of course going to have a single model heavy unit that will be coming in at 145 points. Which means prior to upgrades, this vehicle is going to be marginally cheaper than the AAT and a lot of the other heavy vehicles we see appear in this slot. And unlike all the other vehicles that we have seen in this Kashyyyk Wave, this isn't one of those vehicles where you pay for the chassis and then also have to pay for an actual weapon to mount on it. It does have Arsenal 2 and 2 built-in weapon profiles, so we're not going to see that 30 to 60% points increase when we start looking at upgrades as we would with, say, the Swamp Speeder. But when we move along and take a look at the upgrade options here, we are going to see that new Protocols upgrade here that we saw on the Dwarf Spider Droid. Again, this vehicle is in itself a droid. It does not have droids inside it or other characters piloting it, so that means it is going to have that programming gimmick where you must take a programming upgrade. After that, we are going to see a return of the Ordnance upgrade, something that is somewhat elusive, with the Persuader class tank being the 4th vehicle in the game to include it, and considering that this vehicle does have the Arsenal 2 keyword, it actually is a pretty good candidate to take these Ordnance upgrades. But lastly, we are of course going to have comms. This guy does, after all, have height advantage antennas, and droids always have comms, vehicles always have comms, so of course a droid vehicle is going to have comms, and considering that this is also a transport, there are going to be some pretty good options here. But moving over to the right hand side of the card, we are going to see that this is a ground vehicle, sporting a white defense die with 11 wounds and a damage capacity of 7. And with an offensive and defensive surge, this is going to be about as durable as an ATST, as it will have the full armored keyword, as we will see later. But I do want to make special note of that surge to hit, as this vehicle is going to have a rather large dice pool, and they're not exactly the highest quality, so being able to get some extra hits in there with offensive surge is quite nice. And that will move us along to the weapon profiles themselves, as the Persuader class tank is going to have 2 built-in weapons, the first of which is what you may consider the main weapon on here, and that is the heavy repeating blasters, which are going to have range 1 to 4, and throw 1 red, 2 black, and 2 white dice, with critical 1 and fixed front. So again, if you'd like to compare this to the ATST, it is slightly weaker. However, we do have another ranged weapon built into this unit's profile, so unlike the ATST, you can make use of Arsenal 2 without having to buy more upgrades. And that second weapon is going to be your ion cannons, which are range 1 to 2, and will throw a single rainbow of red, black, and white die, backed up by impact 1 and also ion 1. And this is where things start to get really interesting with the Persuader tank, as there is currently no other weapon in the game that has ion built in to its base unit profile, and I believe aside from the Droid Popper grenade upgrade, this is the only non-exhaustible ion weapon in the game, which when combined with Arsenal 2 on a vehicle that has another weapon, has some pretty strong implications on how this vehicle is going to be played, and may throw a major wrench into the vehicle meta that we've been seeing played a lot lately. But what are my thoughts on the base stats for the Persuader class tank with no keywords involved? Well, if you're going for raw firepower and damage output, it simply is not as good as the AAT. I know we've compared it to the ATST several points throughout this video, but really we should be comparing it to the AAT, as that is what it's competing for in these Separatist lists. And the AAT has proved to be a pretty phenomenal heavy. And that means the Persuader class tank has a very steep uphill battle to justify its presence in your Separatist lists. And with less overall durability and less firepower, you would think we are off to a bad start. However, combining both of those dice pools with Ion 1 means you are likely going to be able to get that Ion token onto your target, and if said target is something like an enemy heavy, who are usually costing at least 100 points, you are going to be chipping away at their action economy, which over the course of a match could prove more effective than just trying to blast them off the table with outright damage. So based on our standard stat line, we are going to have a tank that looks kind of like a saboteur style vehicle who wants to get up close and personal with your enemy's vehicles and short them out with Ion. But of course we have a fully stacked set of keywords here, starting off with Armor and Arsenal 2, which we already mentioned, followed up by the Programmed keyword, which again is going to require you to take one of the programming upgrades, which is going to take this unit into the 150 point range, as it is, again, mandatory. But next up we are going to have the Reposition keyword, which is quite interesting on a vehicle like this, who is on the pill-shaped base, as it is going to be a bit difficult to maneuver them around the battlefield, and this reposition is really going to help you out from getting stuck in awkward positions and angles, and make this vehicle overall just more forgiving to use when it comes to maneuvering it across the battlefield, which is also very nice considering that both of your weapons are fixed to your frontal arc. So while reposition may seem rather inconsequential overall, I think it actually is a huge bonus that keeps this unit from getting stuck in some awkward plays where it may not be able to attack or wind up stuck in an awkward corner of the battlefield. But next up we are going to have one of the major keywords for this unit, and that is going to be Transport 1 Open, which will allow it to transport one trooper unit, and that unit is going to be able to attack from this vehicle and can also be targeted by enemy units, though they will benefit from heavy cover while mounted. So here Separatists are getting their first open transport, something that is pretty rare in the game at this point, and it is obviously a very welcome addition, and will synergize great with things like B2 Haas, or perhaps even Jedi with saber throws, or Count Dooku's lightning. Overall, any vehicle with this keyword is a very powerful tool in your list building arsenal, and I would like to see it show up a bit more in the game, as it does give you some pretty awesome list building options and battlefield strategies. But lastly here for our keywords, we are going to have Weak Point 1, Sides, which is very interesting and actually somewhat of a significant drawback. This vehicle is on that elongated pill-shaped base, so its sides are going to be quite large. Also, this is going to be a bit of a hindrance for people who want to do blocking shenanigans by turning this large vehicle sideways. But honestly, perhaps it's a bit of a good thing to prevent that sort of cheese. But overall, I think this is going to be a bit of a drawback in the unit's overall durability. Certainly not a death knell to the unit, but definitely worth considering. But that is going to wrap up all of our keywords, and what do I think about this unit card overall? Well, the two main things that jump out here is going to be the Open Transport and the Ion in your Range 2 weapon, both of which are very interesting in their own right, and when combined on this same unit card, make it a very utility-oriented vehicle, one that's not only going to let you perform Gav tank shenanigans, but also really chew into your opponent's armor if you zero in on them. That being said, it's definitely not as much as a blunt force vehicle as the AAT is, which is something that I think most people expect from heavies, but I think the AA5 is proving that they don't always have to do that to be viable, and I think the snail tank can do the same, provided you put it in your list with intent and direction behind it. But with all that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the upgrades here, starting off with the protocols, which again we must take one of. And here we are going to see a very different dynamic with this vehicle than we saw on the Dwarf Spider Droid, as the Persuader tank does have a very different unit identity, and will have different priorities in your list than the Dwarf Spider Droid, though our three protocol options here are the same, starting with attack protocols, which will of course give you AI aim and Precise 2, allowing you to reroll 2 extra dice each time you spend an aim token. And while I was a pretty big fan of this protocol on the Dwarf Spider Droid, I don't think it's going to sync as well with the Persuader class tank. As I said earlier, this is very much a utility piece, not a heavy you're taking for DPS, so I don't think you should really be trying to min-max your dice pool, but rather focus on getting this vehicle and its cargo where it needs to be on the battlefield, which will in turn also get those ion blasters that are only range 1 to 2 into action. And like I said earlier, with that weapon, the value isn't doing outright damage to your opponent, but rather taking away their activations with ion, so Precise 2 is going to lose a little bit of its luster on this unit, and you're really going to be suffering if you end up making those AI aim actions, as this very much is a vehicle who's going to want to be move and shooting almost every turn. And for those reasons, I think Attack Protocols is going to be the last of the three that I would choose on the Persuader class tank, as it just doesn't really overall mesh with the priorities of this heavy. But next up here, we are going to have Defense Protocols, which is going to give you AI dodge, and also nimble and outmaneuver, which means a unit with this upgrade is going to make great use of dodge tokens, which on a vehicle with a very large health pool and armor is going to make a big difference throughout the course of a match, and probably ensure that it's not going to get wiped off, lest it be focused down by an ungodly amount of firepower. And on a hyper-aggressive transport that is going to want to be closing ground with your opponent, this is definitely not a bad trait to have. And I could see it viable to simply not shoot with your Persuader tank the first few turns and dodge move, and then dodge attack when you are within range 2 of your opponent's vehicles. which would overall just make it very tedious for your opponent to try and gun down this tank. And if you're trying to go for blocking shenanigans, this could also help mitigate the drawback of having weak point sides. And honestly, I could see defensive protocols being the competitive option for this upgrade slot. But at the end of the day, that is going to have to come down to how valuable is it going to be to shoot this vehicle during the turns prior to when you're in range of that range 2 ion. I know I said the main value of this vehicle's attacks is getting that ion attack in, but that range 1 to 4 cannon is throwing 1 red short of a double rainbow, and if you're just simply not making use of that attack for 3 turns while you dodge move, it will be a bit steeper of a battle for this vehicle to make its points back. Now, okay, if your opponent is dumping a lot of firepower into this unit, the snail tank may be trading up in points on the merit of it simply sponging your opponent's activations. But a skilled opponent who does spot that defensive protocols on your snail tank likely isn't going to fall for that trap, and instead will likely focus fire on the units it may be transporting or other priority targets in your list. It's also worth mentioning that if you are going this route of dodge move until you can dodge attack, you will likely not be taking any ordnance upgrade here, as I will jump the gun a little bit and tell you the main draw of ordnance on this vehicle is engaging at longer ranges with Arsenal 2 before you get in range with that ion gun. So surely all of this makes defensive protocols a bit of a fool's gold, right? Well, not exactly. As I mentioned in the Dwarf Spider Droid video, we now have a ton of ways to get around AI with the introduction of the Super Tactical Droid, and there definitely is the potential combo of running someone like Kalani or a standard Super Tactical Droid alongside a Persuader tank, and either feed them orders with direct AI or perhaps use Override, and then also use Strategize on them to make sure that they get that dodge token, which will not only allow them to make use of that nimble and outmaneuver, but also give them their 2 activations to move and shoot, which makes for a pretty powerhouse vehicle, especially when you start looking at other upgrades like onboard comms channel and link targeting array. So when equipped in the properly built list, I think defensive protocols could be incredibly competitive on the Persuader class tank, but you are going to be doing a bit of a dance here where you need to get off your AI dodge, but also still get a dodge onto this unit somehow. But again, the CIS definitely has the tools to do this, even if you're going as simple a route as something like comms relay and portable scanners on B1s. But let's say you don't want to invest points in other units who are going to babysit your tank, and you really want this thing to be operating as its own component in your list. Well, boy do I have the card for you. It is going to be our third and last protocol, which of course is Engagement Protocols, which for 5 points, 2 points more than the other cards, will simply give you AI Move and AI Attack. Now, okay, this card isn't giving us any cool gimmicks, like Nimble or Precise. But like I said earlier, this vehicle is going to be right at home making move and shoot actions every turn. So having the option to do one or the other will give you pretty full control over what you want to do with this vehicle most of the time. And hey, you can still load it up with tokens anyways, using things like Strategize or Electro Binoculars, and that makes Engagement Protocols a very straightforward card that meshes very well with the Persuader class tank, and will allow you to run it as its own independent element in your list, without having to obsess over getting face-up order tokens on it, and then further support it with things like portable scanners or Strategize. And for those reasons, I am putting my chips in on Engagement Protocols for the go-to protocol card on the Persuader tank. The benefits of defensive protocols may become prevalent in the competitive scene, but it's really hard to say that without any actual playtesting going on. And if I had to predict what people will end up running on the Persuader tank, I would probably hedge my bets, play it safe, and say Engagement Protocols. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. But that will move us along to our ordnance upgrades here, which we are pretty familiar with at this point, though this is only the 4th vehicle in Star Wars Legion to have access to these cards, but in some ways it does almost feel like it's the 2nd vehicle to have access to these cards, as the first 2 vehicles, the AAT and the Saber Tank, don't have much of an incentive to take them. Again, that's due to how their arsenal and barrage works, but they are definitely worth considering on the Persuader class tank, as you will likely have a few turns where that range 1 to 2 ion gun simply isn't in range, and equipping one of these upgrades will make sure that you can buff up your dice pool and maximize use of that arsenal too. And first up here we are going to have our armor piercing shells. A 10-point upgrade that is going to have the exhaust and cycle ability, meaning on the turn you don't fire it, it will recover itself if it's tapped, which is something that is going to be the case with all of these ordnance upgrades. But the armor piercing shells are going to be range 2 to 3, throwing 1 red and 2 black dice, along with impact 3. And the Impact 3 really is the most significant thing here, as when paired with your Ion Blasters will bump you up to Impact 4, which will, on average, force your opponent to roll more defensive dice when targeted by an attack consisting of AP shells and your Ion Cannons. And that is going to make this a pretty strong contender for the Persuader class tank, as it's not only going to give you a longer range weapon to harass enemies with those repeating blasters, but will also give you more bite against armor to ensure that your Ion gets through and disables your opponent. And I think that advantage is going to be extremely noticeable when you're going up against enemy vehicles with red saves, as your stock Arsenal 2 attack is going to net you on average less than 3 hits. And it's not going to be terribly rare to see an opponent with full armor and red saves outright block this attack in full. And as we all know, that Ion keyword does not trigger unless you get a wound through. So with AP shells giving you a second weapon profile for longer ranges, and further bolstering the utility of this vehicle's Ion weapons, it is probably going to be my recommended upgrade here. Though overall, the Persuader class tank is a very good candidate for ordnance upgrades, and there really isn't any non-viable options here. So let's go ahead and take a look at one of the more tricky ordnance upgrades, which is going to be the bunker busting shells. And here, at 12 points, you are going to have a range 1 to 2 weapon, throwing 1 black and 3 white die, backed up by the blast and scatter keyword. And this is very much what I would consider a utility weapon, as you're not taking it for outright damage, but more so for that scatter keyword, which will allow you to move your opponent's units out of cover and into more vulnerable positions. Blast itself is also a very valuable keyword, especially when paired in Arsenal 2 with other weapons. And initially, I know what you may be thinking, hey, a range 1 to 2 weapon is going to pair nicely with that ion gun and increase the utility of this vehicle with the scatter keyword. And after all, I did say earlier in this video that this is a utility vehicle, not something that's doing outright DPS. So why exactly is this not my recommended card? Well, first of all, my initial draw to Ordnance is to get a longer range attack to make use of that Arsenal 2 when you're beyond range 1 to 2. That being said, I think the main drawback with bunker busting shells is how it's going to perform in unison with your other weapon profiles, as it, in my opinion, detracts too much overall from the ion weapon, which I think is a bit more valuable than the scatter keyword here, which again you would be paying 12 points for. Which may be a little bit redundant if you are transporting something like a B2 Haas squad who already has blast and can ignore cover. But how exactly does this ordnance upgrade detract from your ion weapon? Well, if you're shooting at a squad of droids, it actually doesn't at all. You can Arsenal 2 with both these weapons into that squad, and you will be able to ionize and scatter them in the same turn, which is really going to feel bad for the receiving player. However, if you're not going up against a droid list, you will likely be trying to ionize a vehicle with that ion weapon at range 2, and then fire your bunker busters into an infantry target to scatter them out of cover or simply move them into a more vulnerable spot. And with the bunker buster shells, there's not really much of a problem here. So long as you score at least 1 hit, you will trigger scatter and be able to shuffle the unit around, which again, with surge to hit and blast, should be easy enough to do, but you won't be doing much damage with this attack, if any at all. So if you're not in any of those scenarios where you can use scatter to strategically benefit you, it is a very superfluous upgrade. Meanwhile, your ion attack is going to be trying to punch through armor with impact 1 on a single rainbow, which means on average you are only going to be getting 1 hit onto your opponent's vehicle, and needless to say, that is greatly reducing your chances to ionize them. And personally, I would much rather just not pay 12 points to get that scatter in there, and instead arsenal my 2 stock weapons to ensure that my ion gets through, and overall just not split the focus of this vehicle's offensive capabilities, as I would rather pull off 1 strong gimmick than run 2 that may not work at all. And I have to say, if bunker buster shells have not worked out on the Lat LE up until this point, I don't think they're going to find a home on the Persuader class tank either. But lastly, we are going to have our high energy shells, which at 8 points are going to give us a range 2 to 4 weapon, throwing 2 red and 1 white die, with critical 1 and high velocity. And at first glance, this was my go-to option, as it pairs almost perfectly with that range 1 to 4 heavy repeating blaster. Not only does it match that range 4, but it also gives you a respectable amount of additional dice, along with bumping your critical up to critical 2, and gain the high velocity keyword, which prevents your opponents from spending dodge tokens when you target them. So at just 8 points, this is a very good supplement for your Arsenal 2 during those turns where you're out of range of the ion blasters. However, we do have to consider the cycle gimmick going on with this exhaustible card, as you're likely not going to be taking a lot of recovery actions with this vehicle, and with that large pill base, even at speed 1, you are likely going to be closing in with your enemies in 2 or maybe 3 turns tops. and if you only end up firing this ordnance once per game and then switching over to your 2 standard weapons for arsenal, I'm not really sure if it's worth the 8 points. So while this ordnance does initially appear as the perfect pair for that range 4 attack, I do think armor-piercing shells is going to be the way to go. Though I do think all 3 of these upgrades are more viable here than they would be on most other ordnance vehicles. And honestly, if you are really strapped for points, you may even be able to run this without ordnance at all, which would prevent the awkward scenario in which you show up to a match with armor-piercing shells on your Persuader, only for there to be no armored targets in your enemy's list. But with the current AA5 meta and the prevalence of things like AATs, I think those AP shells are going to be a safe bet for the time being. And ironically, if these Persuader class tanks themselves become prevalent, it will also increase the value of those shells, which will aid in your snail cannibalism. And that's not only a pun, but also one of the strangest sentences I've ever said in my life. But that is going to wrap up Ordnance and move us along to our comms upgrades. And while there is several decent options for this vehicle that might work out in niche synergies, there is going to be 2 that I recommend, with one that really is the standout here. The first of which is, of course, Link Targeting Array. And during those turns where you want to strike your opponent's armor first and ionize it before it can activate, this will help you maximize the amount of hits you can get on that target to ensure your ion gets through. And it's honestly always a decent option on vehicles with large dice pools. But the real standout here is going to be the onboard comms channel for just 3 points every time this vehicle is issued an order. It may also issue an order to the unit it's transporting. And as I mentioned earlier in this video, if you are taking the Persuader class tank over the AAT, you are probably doing so to run it as a transport. And we all know how much Separatists like getting their face-up order tokens, which makes this one pretty much a no-brainer. Now, there are other routes you can take with your comms upgrades, with things like HQ uplink and making recovery actions with your ordnance, but at just 3 points, I think comms channel is going to be the way to go. But if there's some sort of other synergy going on here that I'm missing, please leave a comment in the comment section down below. But again, in my opinion, it's going to be the onboard comms channel, and it's not even close. But with all of our upgrades wrapped up, we are now going to move along to the section of this video where I show you how I would recommend building a Persuader class tank when you are including it in your list. And this is going to follow our usual pattern of our most competitive and viable build up front, followed up by some more gimmicky and casual builds that make use of various weapons and upgrades. So first up here, we are going to have our Assault Transport. Again, if you are running a Persuader class tank, I think you are doing it for utility purposes, and this build will extrapolate on that by taking onboard comms channel and AP shells, which will benefit those ion and transport keywords. And we are going to be taking engagement protocols here, as it will more or less negate the drawbacks of AI, as these are actions you will be taking anyways. And once this vehicle is into the thick of it, then you can start issuing it orders to trigger that onboard comms channel, and perhaps take aim and shoot actions during the tank's activation itself when you're trying to ionize your opponent. But at 163 points, this is not exactly an inexpensive vehicle, and there's definitely an argument to be made about either dropping that ordnance upgrade and relying on your standard arsenal too, or perhaps going that AI defense route, which will help keep this large points investment alive on the battlefield longer. But this is likely how I will be running my Persuader class tanks, and I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of deviation from this, be it in the competitive or casual scene. But of course, I am going to have a more casual, fluffy build for you guys, and that is going to be the close support tank. And this one here is going to want to get up close and personal to your opponents, where it more or less can just cause shenanigans by using those bunker buster shells alongside your ion gun. Now, because this tank is going to be in full-blown shenanigans mode and be up close and personal with your opponents, I went with defense protocols to make sure this thing can stay alive, but we also are going to prioritize getting orders onto it, so I included Link Targeting Array to help boost up that ion attack, who might be struggling to get hits through on a single rainbow when you are splitting your fire with the bunker buster shells. So overall, this is a bit of a goofy build, but it could take you a long way in a lucky match, should the stars align, and may actually be the way to go if you are trying to go with blocking shenanigans. Though I suppose the same could be said for the previous build with defense protocols, as that really is the key to mitigating that weak point sides. But now we are on to the final part of the video where I discuss my thoughts on the Persuader class tank, and as I've probably said for the 50th time in this video, this is definitely a utility vehicle, as it simply outright does not beat the AAT in terms of DPS, and its value is really going to come in the form of being a transport. And to put it blunt, if you're not both transporting a powerful unit like B2 Haas and also ionizing enemy targets, you may struggle to justify the 160 plus points that you sunk into this vehicle. I really do believe that the non-exhaustible ion weapon here saves this unit from mediocrity, and you need to make good use of all of this vehicle's elements, otherwise you probably would be better off just taking the AAT. All that being said, with the presence of heavies and vehicles in today's meta, which mind you will only get more potent with the Kashyyyk wave, the Persuader tank may be making quite the splash on its debut, as I do think it's going to be an absolute menace against armor, especially when transporting a B2 Haas squad, and because of all that, I am going to be giving the Persuader class tank a ranking of A. Now, if the AA5 and the AAT weren't as prevalent as they are today, I probably would drop the Persuader class tank all the way down to a B, but both of those vehicles, along with droid armies in general, are very popular right now, and that definitely ups the value, in my opinion, on the Persuader class tank overall. But I would like to know what you guys think about the Persuader class tank in the comment section below. Do you think it's something that is going to lose a lot of value with the inevitable AA5 nerf that will likely come? Or do you think this has a pretty strong place in any CIS list? As always, be polite and explain your reasoning. And if there's any bizarre synergies that I may have missed, please fill me in. And go ahead and leave a like if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications so you don't miss any future videos. I do plan on rebooting some of my previous videos on core units, so make sure you don't miss those. And until then, take care.